Hey, I'm T.A. Charlie, and welcome to The Road to Concord with Professor Joe Bakanovic. Homeroom is on Rumble. You just go to Rumble and search the channels for The Road to Concord. It's one word. When you find it, you go ahead and you click follow. It might mean you got to set up an account, but it's fast, it's easy, it's free. I did it, you can do it. For those technologically challenged members of the class, you can also catch us on Facebook and YouTube. After the show, it's uploaded to Podbean, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and BitChute. Just look for The Road to Concord. You can go to the blog page, that's theroadtoconcord.com. That's where you'll find all your show notes, study notes, and handouts for the class. The phone is working. If you don't know how to call in, email us and we'll think about it. Finally, you can email a professor at joe@theroadtoconcord.com. He's a little slow, but he'll eventually get around to emailing you back. This show is currently mainly listener-sponsored. If you are interested in advertising your business on the show, please email us. With that said, we ask for your participation on a value-for-value basis. If you find our show of value to you, then you provide an equivalent portion of your labor and treasure through the donate link on the Road to Concord blog page, the show description on Rumble, and in the comments on the other streams. And thank you to all of you who have and will support this show.
Natasha, take it away.
What am I taking away this time?
You're on screen.
Oh, in that case, I'll take myself away.
See, I'm a musician. I just made the glitchy AI disappear itself. Good morning. Welcome to the Road to Concord. Today is Thursday, January 22nd, 2026. I am your host, Joe Bakanovic. Today's going to be the first show in a series we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing a book study, but a little bit different than the average book study. Whoopsie, that's not what I want. I'm trying to get the book cover up. Here we go. The book, The Bible Amongst the Myths. There's a link to that book on, in case you want it, on Amazon in the show notes. But we're not necessarily going to be doing a Bible study with this. This is going to be more of an apologetics class, more of a logic philosophy type thing that we're going to be doing. And yeah, Joe, it helps if you take these screens down when you're done with them. We're not going to waste a whole lot of time. We're just going to get right into this. I was originally just going to start with chapter 1, but we might go a little long today because I got to thinking we really need to do the introduction on this. I'm using my Kindle reader here. I am in the book, and we're going to start the author's introduction. This book is written by John Oswalt. He says, the ideas presented in this book have had a long period of maturation. I was first introduced to the subject and the issue in a course entitled The Literature of the Ancient Near East, taught by Dennis Kinlaw at Osbury Theological Seminary in the 1960s. The seeds planted there began to germinate and grow during my graduate studies with Cyrus Gordon in the Mediterranean Studies Department at Brandeis University. They have reached their present level of maturity, such that it is as a result of thinking them through with students in courses I have taught at Osbury Theological Seminary, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and Wesley Biblical Seminary. So you see, he's already following the techniques we taught in our 3-part class on philosophy. He worked through this himself and with his students. He continues, in the period of time since that first course at Osbury Theological Seminary, thinking on the subject has undergone an almost complete change of direction. By the late 1940s, 2 world wars punctuated by a worldwide economic depression had raised some serious questions about the evolutionary paradigm inherent in the philosophy of idealism. And since that paradigm was all but inseparable from the standard higher critical views of the Old Testament that had prevailed for the previous 50 years, there was cause for some rethinking about the Old Testament and the religion it promulgated. That rethinking was led by William F. Albright and his students, among them G. Ernest Wright of the Harvard Divinity School. Speaking for much of the scholarly community of the time, Wright argued that the difference between the Israelite way of thinking about reality and the way in which Israel's neighbors approached that topic were so significant that no evolutionary explanation could account for them. In other words, Israel did not evolve out of the Middle East. There was something else happened. But now, nearly 60 years later, it is widely affirmed that the Israelite religion is simply one more of the complex of Western Semitic religions, and that its characteristic features can be fully explained on the basis of evolutionary change. Now, he's footnoting all of this for you. If you want to get the book and go through it, all the footnotes are in the back. And the reason I'm reading this is so you can get to know a little bit about the author and his purpose, but he's also going to give you some background to the subject we're going to be getting into. Yes, you're dealing with theology, but the way it's being approached these days, even in seminaries, is as just ancient history, archaeology, and comparative religions. That's part of the problem. He will point that out for us as we get going. He continues, what has happened to cause such a dramatic change in thinking? Have some new discoveries made Wright's position untenable? No, they have not. The literatures of the ancient Near East, including that of the Ugarit, which are now cited to prove the case against Wright, were already widely known at the time his book was written. The Dead Sea Scrolls were just coming to light, but they have not materially altered the picture of ancient Israel that was known in the 1950s. So what is the explanation? I do not wish to belittle either the ability or the motivation of current scholars. Their mastery of the field and their genuine concern to ferret out, quote unquote, the real facts are not in question. Nevertheless, I am convinced that it is prior theological and philosophical convictions that account for the change and not any change in the data. Okay, to put this in a biblical way, they always were against the prevailing view of the Bible and the biblical faith. It's just that after World War II, with the change in scholarship, they were allowed to reveal themselves in their true heart. In essence, the apostasy came. This is 2 Thessalonians 2. The man of lawlessness revealed themselves. Man here being capital M, the human who is lawless in their heart, reveals that they are an enemy of the true creator and take their seat in Yahweh's throne, sit on his throne, which is the heart of the human soul, the human being, the human heart. That's the biblical echo forward into time of what Oswalt is hitting on here, in my perspective, my point of view. Oswalt says, in 1950, largely because of the work of Karl Barth, the scholarly world was ready to entertain the idea of revelation, biblical revelation from God, in ways it had not been for at least a couple of generations. Undoubtedly, the near destruction of European civilization in the previous 40 years contributed to the readiness. Revelations assumes that this world is not self-explanatory and that some communication from beyond it is necessary to explain it. Ready to believe in such a possibility, Old Testament scholars in the 1950s saw evidence for it in the manifest differences between the understanding found in the Old Testament and the understanding of all the peoples around Israel. None of that data has changed. The difference between Genesis and Babylon accounts of the origins of the world, for example, are unmistakable to anyone who reads them side by side. Now, let me stop. I want to put a point on this, what he just said. What he's saying is those who are true to the biblical narrative, who take the Bible on its word, in its context, that it was a revelation in human thinking, human history. God, Yahweh, a specific name, Yahweh, entered into this world to reveal himself and the reasons and how he created this universe. But there was a group of people who have always been at odds with that way of thinking, and they look at the same material and interpret it differently. These two ways of looking at the Bible are responsible for how you interpret it, because the data is the same. The interpretation depends on the bias of the one doing the interpreting. This is the problem with all history and all science. Your interpretations of what you're looking at, the data in science or the records in history depend on your personal bias. And he's going to argue that there are only two ways. There's ice cream and sherbet. Okay. I don't care about the flavors. You've either got ice cream or you've got sherbet. They're two different things. They're kind of related, but they're different, cold, sweet treats. That's my metaphor here, my illustration for how to do this. He's going to argue that throughout this book. But he's going to say that what changes everything and it's not just within seminary schools. This is behind the culture wars. This is what's behind the culture war. And he doesn't specifically say that in this book, but it's what he's arguing. He's saying it without using those words. So he's going to tell us that after World War II, we're like, well, the Bible can't be right because look at what just happened. Although had they been reading the Bible from a biblical perspective, World War II was not that hard to explain. So let's keep going. Oswald continues. But the idea that this world is not self-explanatory and that revelation from beyond it is necessary to understand it is profoundly distasteful to us humans. It means that we are not in control of our own destiny or able to make our own disposition of things for our own benefit. In other words, we're not gods. This thought, the thought that we cannot supply our ultimate needs for ourselves, that we are dependent on someone or something utterly beyond us, is deeply troublesome. This is especially true in the light of the revolution in thinking that occurred in the United States in the 1960s and 70s, the hippie generation. The turn away from outside authority of all sorts to extreme individual autonomy was utterly inimical to the idea of revelation. So, although the biblical and ancient Near Eastern data had not changed at all, the possible way of explaining that data did change. Revelation was no longer an option. But without revelation, how can the difference be explained? So in other words, they say revelation is not possible. We're just going to throw that out. Well, then, folks, you're not doing science anymore when that happens. Now you're doing religion. Science says that you cannot throw out a possible explanation before you even start your inquiry. That's not scientific method. That's religion. That's the grounds of shamanism. Oswald continues, it is at this point that another feature of the Old Testament enters the discussion. The undoubted similarities that exist between the literature and the culture of Israel and the literature and cultures of Israel's neighbors. Modern scholars who cannot admit the possibility of revelation now insist that the difference that were so unmistakable to scholars a generation ago are not really that important at all, but it is the similarities that are vital, showing that Israelite religion is not essentially different from the religions around it. This must be so if Israelite religion is merely one of the evolutionary developments from those religions. So what they're saying is from now on, if I find an exception to the rule, ignore the exception. Focus on the similarities. Don't focus on the differences. The problem with that is the differences can change everything. But the modern scholar of the Israelite religion is saying, well, it's not possible to have revelation, so it must be an evolutionary form and blah, 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 blah. Why are they throwing this out? For the same reason they throw out the possibility of supernatural. It offends their sensibilities. There's no other reason to throw it out. Well, we've never observed it. You haven't observed it. Others have. They've recorded it in history. But you're going to throw it out because you don't like their record. Oh, well, that's not real history. Well, you can justify throwing something out all you want. But when you throw out data points in an investigation just because you don't like them, you're not doing science anymore. You're doing religion. Oswald continues. Here we come to the vital philosophical distinction between essence and accident. Please pay attention. This is about definitions. He's talking about definitions. This is pure philosophy. Here we come to the vital philosophical distinction between essence and accident. When we analyze an object, we try to determine which of its characteristics are essential and which are accidental. If you remove an essential feature, the thing will cease to be itself. But if you remove an accidental, there will be no change in the object's essential being. So with humanity, hair is an accidental, while self-consciousness is an essential. All right, this is something that has occupied philosophers for eons. Let me try to boil this down for you. I'm not going to explain it in a definitive way. I'm not going to be able to tell you this is how to look at it. I'm going to give you one way to look at it. If we're talking about the idea of feline, okay, cat in the greater sense, what is essential that makes a lion and a tiger and a bobcat and a mountain lion and a jaguar and a house cat? What is it that makes them all cats? It's accidental that they have different colorings. It's accidental that they have different sizes. It's accidental that they live in different areas. But what is the essential element of them that differentiates them from, say, canines? That's what he's getting at. That's essence and accident. Why is this important? He's going to go ahead and explain where he's going with this for us if we keep reading. It says, but how does this apply to the discussion at hand? What is essential to the Israelite religion? Is it the difference between its understanding of life and those found in the religions of its neighbors? Wright and a large number of other scholars of the 1950s would say yes. Remove these characteristics and it would no longer be itself. Remove those differences that modern scholars want to throw away and ignore, and it's no longer the biblical religion, is what he's saying. So the modern scholars are, in a sense, altering the biblical religion and then claiming it's the same. This is the fallacy of equivocation. You're arguing it's the same thing, but you've removed an essential piece of its essence. It's no longer the biblical faith. And that is part of the problem with the Christian church, is they have removed the essence of the Messiah. And he is no longer the same Messiah. And that started in the 1960s and 70s with the hippie generation. It's not coincidental that it is also the same generation where we kicked God out of the public square. This is all tied together. As we go through this book, I am not restricting myself strictly to the book. I am tying everything I have learned in my life into this study. I am going to comment on it as we go through. You are welcome to do whatever you want with my commentary. But I would ask that you contemplate it. Think on it before you throw it away. Because to me, a lot of things are connecting right now. So he continues. The many similarities to the religions of Israel's neighbors were accidentals. So the fact that all of the developed cultures of the ancient Near East worshipped their deities in temple of similar structure is important, but not essential. It's not essential to the Hebrew faith. What is essential was that there was no idol in the innermost cell of the Jerusalem temple. Today, the situation is turned on its head. Now it is the similarities that are understood to be essential, while the differences are merely accidentals. What is essential is that Israel worshipped a god, as every other West Semitic religion did. The fact that the Old Testament insists from the beginning to the end that there is only one being worthy to be called God is accidental. The problem with that is it was the only ancient Near East monotheistic religion. That is an essential. They're just saying, well, because you worshiped a God, you're the same thing. Folks, this is Isaiah 5:20-21. You're turning reality on its head. He's going to explain how and why this happens. Stick with him. He's setting the table. We're doing philosophy. Yes, there's a comment on the board. Yes, we are doing philosophy. This whole study, this is philosophy in the wild. We're doing it. I'm guiding you through it. Your questions are welcomed. Do not be afraid to stop the entire class and either call in or post a question. That's the purpose of what we're doing. Oswald continues. This issue of differences and similarities will provide the focal point around which this book will revolve. Is the religion of the Old Testament essentially similar to or essentially different from the religions of its neighbors? That discussion will be a further focus of two areas, myth and history. Before the show, I was telling Charlie that this book is an argument with two arguments within an argument. He just gave them to you. Is the Israelite religion, the religion of the Old Testament, different from all other ancient Near East religions? His argument is going to rest on what's myth and what's history. How does that work into this? How does the ancient Near East deal with these two things? those two separate arguments are going to support his greater argument. Is the Old Testament more like the myths found in its neighboring cultures, or is it something else? Is it more creation of humans trying to encapsulate the divine, or is it the miraculous preserved account of the one God, Yahweh, disclosing himself in unique events, persons, and experiences in time and space? In this regard, we will look carefully at the vexed problem of the definition of myth. I will attempt to show that if myth is defined in terms of its common characteristics and functions, the Bible, whatever it is, does not accord with the definition. In other words, the Bible does not meet the definition of myth. Along the way in this discussion, I will point out that once a person or a culture adopts the idea that this world is all there is, as is typical of myth, certain things follow regardless of the primitiveness or the modernity of the person or culture. In other words, no matter how sophisticated you are, once you get rid of this idea, the biblical ideal of the creator and existence and reality, certain things must follow. They're going to follow. That's another one of his arguments. Among these are the devaluing of individual persons, devaluing of life, the loss of an interest in history. History doesn't matter anymore except to the point that you can use it. Fascination with magic and the occult, and denial of individual responsibility. The opposite of these, among which are what we have taken to be the glories of modern Western culture, are the byproducts of the biblical worldview. As that worldview is progressively lost amongst us, we are losing the byproducts as well. Not realizing that they are byproducts, we are surprised to see them go, but we have no real explanation for this departure. Quite the contrary, we have this. If you've been a longtime student of the class, you have encountered this book before. Erwin W. Letzer, When a Nation Forgets God. 7 lessons we must learn from Nazi Germany. When Nazi Germany forgot Yahweh, they fell into pretty much the exact same place we are today. And what this is going to do is, as you forget Yahweh, it opens the door for the return of the gods. The other gods will come back. Now, Oswald's going to say this, just not the same way we're doing it, not with quite the same focus or in-your-faceness, but this is what's going on. Oswald has taken a different path to arrive at the exact same truth that those other 2 books did. When a Nation Forgets God arrived at the same truth, and The Return of the Gods has arrived at the same truth for the exact same reasons Oswald's arriving at it. All 3 of them are sitting in the same stadium, on the same row of bleachers, below the net line, so to speak, right behind the catcher. Or if you're like me, hockey, you're below the boards, right behind the goalie. And the reason being about behind the boards, that means you're safe. The puck ain't gonna fly past and hit you. You're behind the glass. You're in a good, solid position, is what we're trying to say. All right. As I said above, one striking difference between the Old Testament and the literature of the ancient Near East that emerges from a comparative study of the two is the medium by which the divine is known. Among Israel's neighbors, and indeed everywhere else in the world, the medium is nature. But in Israel, nature is only a distant second. Far and away, the medium in Israel is a unique human historical experience. But that recognition raises a further question that will provide the second pole of our study. Are we to think that the experiences described in the Old Testament actually took place? And is it necessary that we think they did? In other words, are these accounts truly historical, and does it matter? For most of the history of the church, that was a meaningless question. Of course these things happened. How could one think otherwise? Compared to the legends and sagas of the world, these narratives breathe authenticity in ways unlike anything else until the attempts of novelists in the last years to give their creations verisimilitude. In other words, make them sound like they're equal. They're not. Biblical stories are very different from the ancient Near East's narratives. Yet today we find an increasing skepticism about the veracity of the Bible's statements about what took place in the past. It is often said that the accounts found in the Bible are only history-like. In response, we will look at the characteristics of the biblical historical narrative and compare them with the ancient Near Eastern approaches to the past. Once again, we will note that whatever the Bible narratives are, they are a different category altogether. If they do not conform to all of the canons of modern history writing, they are still much closer to what characterizes that genre than they are to anything in the ancient world. I will attempt to explain why this is the case. But if modern historical criticism is correct, then we cannot accept that most of the events described in Scripture took place as Scripture reports them. What then? Can the theology that is mediated to us through the historical narratives of the Old Testament be extricated from it? In other words, can we still believe in the God of the Scriptures if the medium through which he presented to us is demonstrably false? I think not. I agree with him. Because the theology of the Bible is presented as though it is an extrapolation from the experience of Israel and the church. The doctrine of election is a result of the historical fact of the Exodus, not the reverse. The land in Israel is Israel's because it is a feudal gift from God given to them as they faithfully followed Joshua into the land in the conquest. God is God, Yahweh is Yahweh, and the Babylonian gods are nothing because he predicts the future specifically, and they cannot. Thus, the New Testament claim that we have an eternal life because Jesus Christ walked out of the tomb on the first day of a certain week is not an innovation. It is simply continuing on the trajectory that was laid out from Genesis to Chronicles in the Hebrew order of the books. If none of these events actually took place, we are left with two inseparable problems. Where did the theology come from? And where did the Israelites get the idea of rooting their theology in fictional human history? Finally, the veracity of the theological claims of the Old Testament is inseparable from the veracity of the historical claims. In other words, the honesty, truthfulness, and should we believe it or not. I do not wish to set up a simplistic either-or argument here. There are important issues that must be addressed. He just told you he doesn't want to create a fallacy. Okay, this is brilliant work here, folks. He's setting things up in a way that's defending himself against accusation of fallacious argument. He's not bringing that to the point. That's not his purpose. He's just writing an absolute, this is a tight logical argument. It's an informal argument, but it is tight. If you've been with me any length of time, you know what I mean by tight. It's going to be very difficult for a critic to take this argument apart. So he says, I do not wish to set up a simplistic either-or argument here. That would be a fallacy. There are important issues that must be addressed. To argue for the veracity of the Old Testament reports is not to close off discussion about the exact nature of these reports. Issues of poetic descriptions versus prose accounts must be taken into consideration. Charlie and I are going to be dealing with that in our Genesis study. That is a big deal. I can recount actual history in poetic form, and it is still history. It's just that you're not. We'll get to that in a minute. Hold on. Oswald's going to continue. The way in which an ancient Semite handles data must not be confused with the ways in which an ultra-modern thinker does. The import of the data is open to varying interpretations, and room must be left for such discussion. But the starting point of the investigation is vital. Do we begin with the bias for the Bible's integrity as historical witness, confident that when rightly interpreted, the data will be self-consistent? And are we willing to suspend judgment when no obvious resolutions for discrepancies present itself? Or do we begin with a bias against the integrity, finding in every problem or discrepancy evidence that the demands we either deny the faith or create some means of saving it that will in the end be insupportable? The comment of James Orr from 100 years ago is still highly apropos. Let one assume and hold fast by the idea that there has really been a great scheme of historical revelation extending through successive dispensations and culminating in the incarnation in Jesus Christ, and many things will appear natural and fitting as part of such a scheme, which otherwise would be rejected as incredible or be taken account of only to be explained away. Ultimately, the unique worldview of the Old Testament undergirds its claims of historical reliability. When we ask the Israelites where they came up with these fantastic concepts, they tell us they did not come up with them. They tell us that God broke in upon their living and dragged them kicking and screaming into those understandings. They tell us that they did their best to get away from him, but that he would not let them go. He kept obtruding himself into their lives in the most uncomfortable ways. If that report is not true, we are at loss to explain where the fundamentally different understandings of life in the Old Testament came from. In the end, I am not advocating the Bible says it and I believe it and that settles it point of view. Although those who disagree with me may argue that to be the case, what I am advocating is a willingness to allow the Bible to determine the starting place of the investigation. It's going to take it at its word. I am not insisting that all historical questions in the Bible can be solved with simplistic answers, or that if a person has questions, he is necessarily doubting the Bible's revelational authority. I am arguing that the Bible will not allow us to disassociate its historical claims from its theological claims, and that our investigation of the history should not assume that they can be so disassociated. I am not suggesting that we should solve historical or theological discrepancies by forcing strained harmonizations upon them. I am asking that we allow the possibility of harmonization and not being by assumption that any discrepancy can be explained by denial of the Bible's own claims in the matter. I am far from denying that there are many similarities between Israel and its neighbors, or that an understanding of those similarities and significance for understanding of Israel's people and its experience. The studies of Israel in the ancient Near East in the last 150 years have been immensely valuable in that regard. But I am asking that we not overplay those similarities so that they obscure the most significant differences that affect every interpretation of the similarities. What I am calling for in the end is that the evidence supporting the Bible's claims to have been revealed be given the attention that it deserves, and that arguments growing from a fundamental disbelief in that possibility not be given a privileged place in the discussion. Now, let me reframe this before we go to the bottom of the hour break. When we come back, we'll start with part one, the first chapter. Let me just put a focus on this real quick. What he's saying is take the Bible in its own context and accept its own assertions, and then test it against itself in comparison to the ancient Near East. He's saying, do not start with your modern bias and impose your modern demands and sensibilities on an ancient document and then say, well, it doesn't meet up to the modern standards, so it's got to be false. That is fallacious. That is not sound reasoning. That is so bad as to be thrown out the window. If that's how you come at the Bible, I dismiss you out of hand because you're intellectually dishonest. Oswalt doesn't say that. I will. Anybody who approaches the Bible on that grounds is so intellectually dishonest as to not be permitted into the discussion. That's because you are purposely creating the result and conclusion you want before you even begin. You're not even worth listening to. And you're not. And I won't. He didn't set his argument up that way. He just said, let's accept the Bible for what it claims to be in its own words, on its own merits, in its own context of its time and culture. Now let's look and see if that is significantly different than from the rest of the ancient Near East. Is it an essential difference? And if it is, and you can't find another rational, logical explanation for that difference, you must accept the assertions in the Bible. You have no other explanation. That's all he's arguing. We're going to go take a bottom of the hour, 3-minute break. When we come back, we'll start with chapter 1. Charlie? right, folks. We're about to get into this, but real quick, let me paraphrase what's going to be going on. This is how I've argued this before. You've heard me argue this before. Mr. Oswald's going to pretty much argue the same thing. He's just not going to use the same language. The march of history, it's a modern Western idea that history is going somewhere. That ideology was not possible until after the advent of Scripture, but more specifically, when the scriptural worldview was paired with the Greek reasoning. That's when we got the idea that history was heading somewhere. Now, the Israelites knew it, but not to the extent that we think of it. The science, as we understand it, was not possible without the biblical worldview paired with Greek logic. You're about to understand why this is absolutely true. And it comes from the different ways of looking at things. There's only two worldviews. There are only two worldviews. Everything else stems from one of those worldviews. Science, when we developed it, it was a purely Christian, quote unquote, Christian development. Yes, you had pseudoscience or science-like things before then, but it came into its own because of Christians looking to better understand the Creator. But once we married that science, the true scientific method, with the arrogance of man, we end up, quote unquote, killing Yahweh. Well, that opened the door to secular humanism. Secular humanism opens the door to the return of the gods of ancient times. And hence that gives rise to what Oswald's going to call neo-paganism. And the cycle continues. Well, in the biblical worldview, that's not a cycle. That was foretold from the beginning that this would happen. It's in your Bible. From a pagan worldview, it's proof that their worldview, their perspective is true and the biblical one is false. This world was created in such a way that you can see either worldview. And usually what happens is you start with the pagan worldview and you move up to the transcendent biblical worldview. But you can go back down if you want to. You get red pilled and then you take the blue pill again. All of this stuff in your popular culture, it's not an accident. If you're looking at that from the worldly perspective, you're not going to see it. If you're looking at the history in our society from a transcendent perspective, it's in your face. Oswald doesn't point that out. I'm going to. We're about to start this book in earnest. I will not hold back on my commentary. This is Joe in all his obnoxious self-glory. I got my philosopher's hat firmly in place. I will interject where and when I feel fit. That's the whole purpose of this. This book, it's not for me to say, hey, listen to Oswald. Oswald is springboarding me. I don't like self-promotion, but to the extent that I do, this is me telling you this book is just a springboard. This study is actually about me sharing with you how everything is being knitted together as I read this book. Everything I've learned my whole life has come together in a thunderclap the second time I read this book. Chapter 1, the Bible in its worldview. The Western world has been founded on a certain way of looking at reality. The Western world was founded on the biblical worldview. Obviously, that way of understanding is an amalgam of many separate contributions, but without minimizing the importance of others. In other words, I'm not going to belittle them. It can be asserted with confidence that the Bible is the single most important of these contributors, especially when its outlook was integrated with the contributions of Greek philosophy, first by Augustine and then by Thomas Aquinas, or Augustine, depending on how you pronounce it. So these two Christian forefathers, they integrated Greek thinking into Christian theology. These thinkers showed that the transcendent monotheism of the Bible provided the metaphysical foundation for the Greek thought, something that the Greek philosophers lacked. They missed it. And when you have that missing, you end up more with somebody like, you end up with Cicero, who is really close to Romans 1 and 2. Or you end up with Ayn Rand. They're close, but they're not in the ballpark. They're still outside of the ballpark of truth. So they provided the metaphysical foundation for Greek thought, while using Greek thought provided a means of logically organizing the observations about reality found in the biblical narratives. In other words, they advanced the understanding of the Bible. This happens because at this point in time, the The word of God, the Torah, is going to go out from Jerusalem. It's no longer confined just to that little piece of land that we call Israel or Judea. It's now going to go into the entire world, which at the time was predominantly Greek. Hellenization. That was a problem for the Jews. They did not like the Hellenized Jews. It does not mean that you are not a faithful believer of the Bible. It means you are looking at the principles in the Bible from a different perspective. You can find capital T truth from any perspective you look at it. We will all get into the ballpark. We'll just be using different conceptualizations, different language follows. It's like saying, well, if I confuse your language at Babel, none of you can ever agree or work together again. Yes, you can. It just requires more work. It requires a concerted effort. You have to want to work together now. Have to learn to talk each other's language, think in the way each other thinks. That's all we're saying here, is if you think like a Greek, you're not going to understand the Hebrew perspective of the Bible unless a Hebrew who understands the Greek thinking explains it to you. Oh, you mean like Paul? Now you know why Paul is the apostles to the Greeks, to the Gentiles. He was a Roman citizen. He understood Greek. He understood how the Greeks thought. He even quotes Greek philosophers and Greek poetry in the Bible. That's what he means by becoming all things to all people. He didn't mean he agrees with you and becomes you. He means he talks to you about the Bible's concepts and teachings in terms you will understand. He appropriates your cultural references and understandings to teach you the eternal transcendent principles that are espoused in the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures. We have to take it on that ground, on that merit. That's what Oswald's arguing. Greek thought. Greek philosophers of the 7th through the 3rd century BC intuited that this is a universe and not a polyverse. They proved logically that infinity, an infinite existing universe, is an impossibility. They also proved logically that there must be an unmoved mover, a creator of the universe who is outside of the laws of physics. There's an equal and opposite reaction to every action. Well, that's what they mean by unmoved. It must be a creator who does not suffer the equal and opposite reaction. By definition, we understand this as transcendence. They did not fully understand that concept. That's one of the reasons that their philosophy stagnated. They were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. The Greek thinking can get no farther than what we call natural law. Romans 1 and 2. But now, if you do not posit that to a transcendent creator, you end up with natural law the way the Greeks did. The same thing as Thomas Hobbes. Essentially, might makes right. So you cannot find a transcendent morality. You can only find ethics. And this is why they were always arguing on what the universal mode of morality of good and bad and desirability was. They couldn't settle on that, even amongst themselves, because they did not have the transcendent compass. The Bible gave that to them. So the Greek philosophers do not become the Greek philosophers we know today until after the Bible intrudes into their worldview. Yes, this I know is a fact from philosophy school. So that's part of where Oswald is. He continues. They, the Greek philosophers, believed that there must be a single unifying principle in the cosmos. Furthermore, they believe that this is a real world in which effects are the results of observable cause. I got a note here, this is Romans 1 and 2, what we think of as natural law. In addition, they believed that these causes and effects were discoverable through rational thought. To some extent, this is true. It's called a priori knowledge. However, this is knowledge and understanding gained strictly through reason alone, without observation and experimentation. It has real limits. And it is often, many times you'll find that observation will result in something counter to what you expected. For example, if I sit and think of how things are supposed to work in the ocean biologically, a blue whale shouldn't exist, and yet it does. It's too big. It should not exist. It's too big for that thing to exist, and yet it does. There it is. So a priori reasoning has its limits. It's one of the problems that the Greeks encountered. In addition, They, the Greek philosophers, believed that these causes and effects were discoverable through rational thought. At the foundation of this thought was the conviction that something could not be so and not so at the same time. This is one of the quote unquote first principles, not first as in it is the very first in a series 1, 2, 3, but first as in foundational, primordial. These are the first principles you need before you develop anything else. It's the first principle of philosophy. It's the first principle of non-contradiction. You cannot have contradictions in the world. Oswald's going to continue. He says, increasingly, this way of thinking brought the Greek philosophers into conflict with the dominant thought of the world up until that time. That thought insisted this is a polyverse in which we live. Now, this is where we start getting into today. Polyverse. It's similar to the modern affinity for the multiverse, which is the same thing by a different name. So that multiverse is in all of your cultural hip hop stuff right now. It's in the Avengers Infinity Wars. It's a multiverse. We got multi dimensions. The UFOs are for multiple dimensions. We'll accept that. That's paganism. That's paganism. That is paganism. So Oswald hasn't called it that yet. Give him time. He says that thought insists that this is a polyverse. So the Greek culture says it's a polyverse, wherein existence is the result of a conflict of many different forces, most of them unseen and many of them unknowable. You know this too. This is similar to how secular humanists see society as the result of class conflicts. They cannot see it any other way. The rich got to be stealing from the poor. The powerful have to be stealing from the oppressed, et cetera, et cetera. Society has to be born out of a struggle between these different forces. What secular humanists do is divorce it from the idea of other gods fighting these battles, because the secular humanist has made himself God, and they say so. Okay, Marx, I'm going to destroy the whole world so I can walk through the ruins as a creator. I'm going to be the new God. They say this all the time. John Dewey, I'm the new God. Okay. So that's the rise of the new paganism, neo-paganism. As a result, it becomes all but impossible to determine why anything that happens, why it happens that way. So a pagan does not believe in cause and effect. There are almost infinite number of potential causes for any event, and the majority of these are in the realm of the invisible, which is the real world. To the pagan, the invisible is the real world. Well, this is Gnosticism. Gnosticism has many flavors. We call it Kabbalism. You call it by many different names. It's mystery religions, mystery faith. Whether you like it or not, Masons are Gnostic. Anybody who believes in secret knowledge, the Illuminati would be another form of Gnosticism. And I don't mean ancient Masons, I mean modern Masons. The modern Masonry is not what it started out to be. It underwent a transformation, a metamorphosis. So if you're thinking in terms of secret or hidden knowledges, that's Gnostic. Now be careful, because the Bible will tell you, you got to dig for secret knowledge. No. It's not secret knowledge. It's fuller understanding. When it says secret knowledge, it means hidden, but it's hidden right there in plain sight. The only way you get to understand that is to take the Bible at its word. Take it for what it says it is. Accept that, and then try to reason with it and wrestle with it on its terms. As you do that, and you surrender to it, you'll start to understand what it's trying to teach you, and you see, oh, it was right there in front of me this whole time. Okay, because of the fundamentally unreality of the observable world, they don't think this world is actually real. It is entirely possible for something to be so and not so at the exact same time. There's this cognitive dissonance that Mr. Holt was talking about a minute ago. This is holding two contradicting ideas in your head at the same time and thinking that they're both true. That's the cognitive dissonance of the materialistic world. Marx had a word for it. What was it? The dialectic or something like that. Mr. Zinker probably knows better than I do. But this is also the confusion within modern quantum mechanics, where they think something can exist and not exist at the same time. By definition, that's not possible. By definition, that is not possible. What if that item just doesn't exist in the visible, observable realm of our world? Well, Joe, now you're talking about interdimensions. No, not in the way you're thinking of it. I'm thinking of it in the biblical cosmology. We'll get to that Tuesday. Next Tuesday, we'll get to that. So I'm just going to put a pin in this for right now. Like I said, if you're thinking of all of this biblically, it's going to make sense, which is exactly what the quote Oswald had earlier said. If we think of the Bible biblically, the way the Bible wants to be understood, all of this falls into place. Click, 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 click. Makes a big picture. Mr. Holt said, did ancient Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians, Samaritans, etc., think critically? Like, did they have a sense of agency, or did they think that their urges, actions, and pursuits were directed by some deity? Mr. Oswald's going to get to that for us. He's going to get that in great detail in the future. But the short answer here is no, they believed that they were controlled by the deities. But they could, in turn, control the deities as well. So it was a back and forth play. This is where their ritualistic tendencies come from. They also believed in cyclical terms. That everything's a cycle over and over and over again, like the Mayan calendar, where the Bible believes time is a linear pursuit. Starting at A, you're heading to Z. There's no cyclic nature in there, except in the sense of your nature. A cat is still going to be a cat. A dog is still going to return to its vomit. A pig is still going to return to its mire. That's not cyclic in the way of you're going to have 4 seasons, night follows day, et cetera, et cetera. That's the type of cycles we're talking about. That's paganistic in its thinking. All right. We'll get to this as we go through. He deals with that question in great detail, Waterjug. Ultimately, this conflict between philosophers and prevailing religious culture was won by the culture. Socrates was forced to drink hemlock, and while Plato and Aristotle, his successors, were able to live out their lives, they were the end of their line. In other words, that thinking didn't continue. While the philosophic tradition was never really submerged into Greek thought, it was never able to exercise a dominant hold on the Greek culture. The Bible would say that's because the worldly will not allow the spiritual to exist, the transcendent. But most likely, the Greek philosophers were never able to truly grasp the concept of transcendence or the ramifications that flow from it. If they did, they might have had more of an effect on the culture. Instead, what dominated the culture was the worldview of myth, with all of the characteristics just mentioned, which that had a hold on society. Now, we're going to go through this section real quick with a little commentary. The Greek playwright Euripides, in his play The Bacchae, portrays this struggle and its eventual outcome in a devastating way. Now, the Bacchae, it's the Bacchanalia. Did you see the big opening to the Olympics here just a few years back, where you had that blue guy and this party and the LGBT rainbow thing? That was literally a Bacchae celebration. That's what that is. That is the ancient paganism right in your face, and most of the modern world not understanding what they're seeing. So that's what that is. It's the return of the gods, because the Bacchae is connected to God worship of polytheism. So in it, Euripides, he uses a group of men to represent the rational side of human nature and depicts them explaining why their point of view is much superior to the largely irrational, but ultimately more vital aspect of the nature represented by a group of women. Now, this is not an accident. By nature, men tend to be more rational, more spatially oriented. Women tend to be more physically oriented, more materially oriented, more emotional. And more, the female psyche is much more to the continuous worldview, and the male psyche is much more toward a transcendent tendencies. So Euripides is playing on an observable fact that's straight out of the Bible. This is in the Bible. It just doesn't put it the way we're explaining it. So he's not hitting on a nothing burger here. The actions centered upon the annual Bacchanalia, when Bacchus, a god of wine, is celebrated. There are a lot of orgies in this time. The men want to reduce this worship to a set of rather lifeless ideas and theorems, while the women want to participate in the inexplicable but terribly real experience of unity with the god. In other words, they want to become one with the god. Ultimately, the women win, hacking the men to pieces in the course of the worship. It takes little explanation to understand the author's point. Rational thought is finally unable to compete with mysterious and largely incoherent worldview effective experience. In other words, feels good, do it is going to beat rationality all the time. Your fear is going to beat rationality all the time. So barring some intervention by a higher authority or being, the higher energy state of transcendence will inevitably yield to the second law of thermodynamics. What do I mean by that? Like I said, we're going to take whatever time we take. This is probably going to go a little longer today because we're already coming up on the top of the hour. We'll finish chapter 1 today, no matter what. This is an important thing to me, whether you like it or not. That's your choice. But what I have explained to you before is the transcendent, the born again, the spiritual perspective of the world. That's a higher energy state. It requires you to constantly be working to stay there. That is exhausting. The human animal hates that. But this is what Peter says. The human animal wants to live like an animal. Orgies, gluttony, just do whatever the heck you want, lawlessness, chaos, because ultimately, I believe in all these different gods. I'm not in charge of anything. Therefore, I can't be responsible for anything. It's just all karma, whether I got good luck or bad luck. And you're just adrift in a sea of chaos. There's nothing you can do about it. So just make your life as comfortable as possible. Peter, the apostle Peter, says that type of person is an animal good for nothing but to be led to the slaughter. The born again, transcendent, spiritual person must strive to stay there. You have to constantly be thinking transcendent worldview. It is exhausting. You have to finish that race. If you don't, you're going to be like the guy in the Matrix. Pop the blue pill, go back into the make-believe world, live all happy and comfortable for now. But there's a hereafter. And that's what the animal wants to get away from. I want to reject the transcendent Yahweh. Because if I can get rid of you, if I can kill you, then I don't have to worry about the consequences of my actions. That's what this is all about. That's what the Bible says this is all about. So we're going to take the Bible on its terms, its assertions. And Oswald's doing the same thing. Let's go a little further before we take a top of the hour break. There's a certain irony in the Bacchae because it was almost the last of the great Greek dramas. These dramas were written to perform during the Bacchanalia, and they were an attempt to wrestle with the great issues of life, especially as these were exposed in the conflict between the two ways of looking at life that the Greeks were experiencing during this time, rationality versus emotionality. As one of the last of these great dramas, the Bacchae seems to be a historical statement admitting that the attempt to integrate the two opposing views had failed and that the old anti-rational way had won. The world cannot tolerate the transcendent. It will seek to destroy it at all costs, even if it means its own extermination or its own extinction. So what Euripides was trying to do was wrestle with transcendence as best he understood it. He's just looking at rationality. He's looking at universal laws. Well, folks, a universal law is transcendent. Its nature is transcendent. If it's universal, it is above and beyond the natural world. So reason is transcendent. Mathematics is transcendent. The controlling nature or logic of language is transcendent. The natural laws are transcendent, which means they have a law giver. And that's part of what the Greeks were wrestling with. Charlie, do your best to keep an eye on the comments here. If there's something I need to see or you think I need to see, make sure you draw my attention to it. Because my eyes on two different screens, I can't actually keep up with the discussion here today. Let's see real quick. All right, this is a good point. Take our break so that we don't interrupt this too much. 3 minutes, please. 3, 1, 2, 3. 3-minute break, and we'll come back and we'll keep going. We're going to probably lose Charlie somewhere along the way because he's got an appointment today, but we have our glitchy AI to take over, and she will monitor y'all's comments for me and your questions. 3 minutes, and we'll be back at it. All right. Real quick, just an FYI, we're probably going to end up going 2 hours today. It's just the nature of what I've decided we're going to do with this show. But we got a comment on the board from James William Holt. This is not only that, based on what you said earlier, paganism gave its believers agency over their gods. That has opened my eyes, Joe. Yes, this is what the idols are all about. The way you act toward the gods as a pagan helps you control the gods or barter with the gods for good favor and blessing and good fortune, and to keep from being punished. So, for example, they make idols. In the Hebrew word, it's teraphim. And what that idol is, you cut holes in the eyes and the mouth, and the god would enter into the idol. That's a way of calling their gods down from the heavenly realm down to the earthly realm, so that they were localized in your idol, and you could barter with the god and try to bind them and hold them to things that, well, I did this for you, now you owe me, God, and whatever. But there's also other things, that the sacrifices, burnt sacrifices, was a way of feeding the gods. You had to burn it so the smoke could go up to the gods, and the gods would eat the aroma of the sacrifice and the worship. That's how you fed them. But also, if you wanted to maintain fertility or whatever, that's what ritual prostitution was all about. If you had sex here in this realm, you forced the gods to have sex with each other, which guaranteed fertility both in your crops and in your children. And this is how they think. This is how they thought, and they still think this way today. This is at the core, the root of pagan thinking. And yes, it's a way of bringing the gods down to you and you controlling them. So Hebrew thought. At the same time as the Greek philosophers were struggling to articulate their point of view, there was a parallel series of events taking place at the east end of the Mediterranean. Between 625 BC and 400 BC, the Israelite people went through the crisis of their faith. While Old Testament scholars continue to argue about the precise historical details of the crisis, the general outlines are clear enough. The crisis was prompted by the rise of the first Assyrian and then Babylonian empires. The ability of these two groups to achieve military and political dominance over a large part of the ancient Near East called Israel's particular faith into question. Folks, this is Dr. Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 cosmic geography worldview. This is the unseen realm. Because the Assyrians and the Babylonians were able to defeat them, it proved that their gods were stronger than Yahweh in their mindset. That's still pagan thinking. So Yahweh is sending them into dispersion. He's allowing these nations to conquer Israel to beat this pagan thinking out of their heads. You've got to quit thinking this way. My prophets told you this was going to happen. If you didn't repent, here it is. It doesn't mean these gods beat me. Yahweh thinks talking here. It means I handed you over to be punished because you just reject my covenant. That's what the Bible argues. But to an Israelite who's stuck in this pagan worldview, it proved that the Assyrian and Babylonian gods were stronger than Yahweh. Therefore, maybe my faith is nothing after all. So Oswald continues. This faith had been and continued to be drawn in sharp relief by a series of persons we know as the prophets. The prophets had articulated an understanding of reality that was starkly different from that of the peoples around them. The present editions of what those leaders asserted that these ideas did not originate with the prophets, but the prophets were only trying to call the people back to that understanding that had been theirs from the very time of their emergence as a people hundreds of years earlier. So the prophets are saying, this is not my idea. This is Yahweh talking to me. Now, in the Bible says Yahweh shows up in physical form and talks to these prophets face to face, and they recognize him. In some cases, he shows up and kicks them. Yeah, literally, they're asleep, and he kicks them awake in physical form and then tells them, here's what you need to know. The prophets will tell you that they have physical meetings or spiritual vision meetings with Yahweh, and Yahweh tells them what to tell the people. That's Dr. Heiser's unseen realm. He has shown you in the scriptures where scripture says this. So we got to take this on face value. Did this actually happen? Well, no, those types of things can't happen. Why? Well, because they don't. Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean. Have you been to Japan? Or any of you, think of somewhere you've never been. Does that place exist? Well, yeah, Joe, it does. How do you know? You've never been there. You haven't seen it. You don't know. So we're just going to dismiss it. Any place I've never been in my life, it no longer exists. Well, Joe, that's crazy. Bingo. So if you dismiss the supernatural the same way, it's crazy. It's intellectually dishonest. Just because it offends your sensibilities doesn't mean it isn't a possible answer to the problem. So Oswald continues, amongst those ideas were the following. There is only one God. God is the sole creator of all that is. Ex nihilo. We're going to get into that in our Genesis study. Since this world is not an emanation from him, it has a real existence of its own. God has revealed himself to humans primarily in the context of their unique experience in space-time. He has communicated an explicit will for human behavior in this world, and he rewards and punishes on the basis of obedience to that will. Transcendent monotheism broke into the material spiritual realm and revealed itself in the Creator's will, both in person and through inspiration. Today, we have this idea that we're all just some sort of hologram, or we're a program being run or plastered on the inside of a black hole or whatever, or this world isn't really real. We're just some sort of manifestation of the deities. Back to pagan thinking. Remember, this world's not real. The spiritual world is. That is pagan thinking. But we're hiding it in, well, it's quantum physics. It's modern science. No, it's not. You have dismissed the possibility of the supernatural, and at that point, you quit doing science. So don't appeal to science anymore. It doesn't meet the definition. You've gone pagan. It's what Oswald's arguing. He's just not saying that yet. He says, much like the positions of the Greek philosophers, these ideas came into direct conflict with the views that were current all around Israel. There are many gods. The visible world is an emanation from them, and as such has no real existence of its own. This is how pagans think. The gods are known through their identity with the great natural cycles of the cosmos. The gods have no purpose except those that humans have. In other words, they are personifications. Survival, dominance, comfort, and pleasure. Humans exist to provide these for the gods. If humans do care for the gods will reward them. And if they do not, the gods will punish them. So this is modern materialistic secular humanism. They see man as his own god. Hence, they see some men and women as higher, quote unquote, gods in their pantheon. They are and defer to these people much the same way pagans defer to their gods. So in secular humanism, Marx is a higher god than you might be, or Lenin might be a higher god, or Castro, or maybe Nancy Pelosi is higher than Ocasio-Cortez or whatever, and they treat each other this way, and they defer to each other this way. This explains what we're seeing them do. It is a form of secular humanist pagan worship to each other. Remember, the secular humanist is not an atheist. I know Mr. Holt said, well, I was an atheist at one time. No, you were not. You were a pagan, and you were your own god. And those men and women that might be thinking that you referenced or you sought, you gave authority in your life to because of their thinking or their arguments, those became the higher gods in your pantheon. You didn't think of it that way because you rejected the idea of God. But form and function define, not your will. And I'm not picking on Mr. Holt here. I'm just any atheist. It's the form and function. You're performing, you're showing a pagan form of religion. You've just changed what you call it or how you conceptualize the gods. You just changed the ice cream flavor. You didn't change the ice cream. So it's got the form and it's serving the same function. So that's ipso facto. It's the same thing. So much like the positions of the Greek philosophers, these ideas came into direct conflict with the views that were current all around Israel. There are many gods. This is the word, the visible world. Okay, I read through that. Sorry. He picks up here. As a result of this conflict and understandings of reality, the eventual capture of Israel, first by the Assyrians and then by the Babylonians, caused a real crisis of faith. It forced the Israelites to question whether or not Yahweh was truly their God. Now, starting in 2 weeks, we're going to be doing a book study that addresses the conquering of the northern and southern kingdom. That had been foretold. And that had been dealt with by the prophets. Yahweh told the people what was going to happen ahead of time. So he's telling them, no, it's not a greater God. It's actually serving my purpose. I am still in control. This is still according to my plan. All of this, folks, Charlie and I have tried to tell you, all of this is coming together for us. This is very difficult for me. All I'm going to do is ask you to stay as much as possible. Watch every show we do for the next few months. If you miss one, go back and catch it. I can't keep referring to these things all the time. They're going to come together, though. I guarantee you they are going to come together. This is everything we're going to be doing for the next few months works together, and it is firmly rooted in the Bible. So the Israelites realized that these two different understandings of reality could not coexist. If they had not formally expressed the logic of non-contradiction as the Greek philosophers had, they still understood that if the other understanding of reality was correct, theirs was false. So in other words, transcendent monotheism or worldly polytheism, they can't both be true. And surely the fact that the Assyrians and the Babylonians had triumphed over them showed that the Assyrians and Babylonians and everybody else was correct. So would the unusual Israelite faith disappear? When Jerusalem finally fell, would the final remnant adhering to the faith in Judah give it all up and admit that they had been wrong? Folks, this is Dr. Heiser's Unseen Realm before Dr. Heiser published Unseen Realm. Many paths to the same truth. Dr. Oswald has arrived at the same place that Dr. Heiser did. Took a different path, same truth. So he says, as a matter of fact, they did not. So they didn't go away. There is no Old Testament version of the Bacchae. Excuse me, folks. The pagan vision of reality did not triumph over Israel. Why it did not is still and probably will remain a matter of controversy. What note did I? Scripture tells us the Yahweh will always preserve a remnant for himself. Well, yeah. It's just a note I stuck in here. As far as the biblical text is concerned, there were several contributing factors. One was the fact that the prophets had boldly predicted that the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests would be evidence of God's work in history to punish his unbelieving people. Yep. Telling the end from the beginning proves that Yahweh is superior to the other gods and that, in fact, he is the only God. Because these other pagan gods, they don't believe in an end to beginning and at all. So how can another God predict the future? Can't. And nowhere in history does he. But even Muhammad doesn't tell prophecy. He's not a prophet. His words, not mine. So, but coupled with this prediction of the conquest and the exile was also the prediction of a return from exile, something that had never occurred before during the many centuries in which exile had been practiced as an instrument of foreign policy. So this is something that had never happened before. Making his prophecies come true is yet another way Yahweh demonstrates his command over everything that has been created and through history and human actions. The resurrection of Israel a second time is a prophecy that it's never happened before. When you ignore the supernatural, you're ignoring Israel as it exists today. You say, oh, that can't happen. It just did. So this is part of the problem that the biblical skeptic runs into when they dismiss the supernatural. Thus, when the exile and return did occur as predicted, it certainly became easier for Israelite believers to believe that the interpretation of the exile that the prophets had given was the correct one. It was an indication of the triumph of the gods. It was not an indication of the triumph of the gods, but of God using the pagan nations as his tools, as he said he would. Also, there's a prophecy that once the Jews had returned, they would never again stray. They would never again become pagan. They'll become apostate. And by that, I mean that they're going to corrupt their faith. And while they have done that, they have never left Yahweh as the focus of their worship. The names of the Baals has been removed from their mouth. That's a fulfillment of prophecy. So that's another fulfillment. The Jews have been the Jews ever since. Okay. Yes, they've strayed from the way the Bible tells them to operate their faith, how their faith is supposed to look and work. But they're still on that same faith. They've never strayed from it. More prophecy. And that's a supernatural event, folks. You show me somebody in the world that has stuck to an idea like this long. 2,000 something years. Well, the Marxists, Joe. No, they don't. They didn't stick to Marx. Not one. None of them have ever tried to do what Marx has done. They've stuck to their own ideas of it. It's kind of like the libertarians. They're all individual gods, so they all have their own idea of what libertarianism is. Well, the Jews have stuck to the rabbinical Judaism. Yeah, there are different divisions and sects and all, but they've stuck to Pharisaical, Judaism. That doesn't happen in human history is what I'm getting at. By definition, that's a supernatural transcendent thing. Oswald continues, another factor that played a part in the survival and peculiarity of Israel's worldview was, according to the text, the survival of an authoritative collection of books that the Israelites understood to record the origin of their faith and the narrative of the way in which the faith had fared in the Israelite experience. So the survival of the scriptures. Thus, the priest Ezra returned from Babylon with the authority to teach the Torah of his God, which was the core of the collection, Ezra 7:25. And one of the early acts of Nehemiah after the rebuilding of Jerusalem's city wall was to sponsor a public occasion in which Ezra read the Torah to the people. Thus, in addition to any subjective faith that the people might have had, there was an objective standard that stood over and against them and called them to account. An objective standard is a transcendent law or a transcendent standard. Objectivity is transcendent. It's outside of the people's control. That law was given by Yahweh. So the people don't control it. In the pagan world, they do control their laws. They don't believe in universal morality. So if you run into somebody today, well, what's right and wrong for you is not necessarily what they're a pagan. They're telling you I'm a pagan. Well, no, no, you're not. Pagan Christian, maybe, but you're not a follower or a disciple of the Messiah, Yeshua. Period. Because you're not bowing to him. You're bringing him down and laying control over him. Exactly what the Catholic Church says it has done to the Word of God. It says it has authority over the Word of Yahweh. No, it doesn't. The Catholic Church, that came right from the Pope and the Vatican, that tells you that they're pagan. Their words, not mine. It's in their records. They boasted about it. They say that the proof that they have control over the scriptures is that they moved the Sabbath. Their words, not mine. They're claiming that they are God. They're pagans. Period. Whether you like it or not, I can't help you. But that's just a fact of the matter. This is the type of thing that Oswald is hitting at. This is the type of thing that explodes in my head when I was reading this book. To be sure, it appears that the Israelites swung directly out of one ditch into another. Prior to and immediately after the exile, according to the text, there was a tendency to take a rather cavalier attitude toward God's commands. Many people thought they could live according to the pagan worldview while giving lip service to the biblical one. That's what the Christian church does today. Because of the work of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi, whom we know, and many others whose names we do not know, there came the conviction that the only way to avoid another dose of divine punishment was to get serious about worshiping Yahweh exclusively. Unfortunately, the understanding of exclusive worship that developed was one of literalistic obedience to the commands without the kind of alteration of attitude that the commands were designed to foster. That's legalism. But be that as it may, the survival of the distinctly biblical understanding of reality was assured, combining Greek and Hebrew thought. What we find then at the beginning of the Christian era was, on the one hand, the biblical worldview, which had not been worked out with philosophical consistency, but which had about it a vigor and vitality stemming from its survival in the crucible of life. On the other hand, there was the worldview of the Greek philosophy, which did have the logical consistency, but had proved unable to be translated into the common experience. It was when the gospel of Jesus, presupposing the Israelite worldview, penetrated into the Greco-Roman world that the stage was set for the combination of the Greek and Hebrew worldviews in the distinctively Christian way. Zechariah, I will stir up your sons, O Greece, against your sons, O Zion, or O Zion against your sons, O Greece. In other words, the scriptures are going to explode out into the world and into the Greco-Roman world in a way that they're going to be able to understand the concepts that the Hebrews had. As a result of that combination, there was now an explanation for the Greek intuition of a universe. There is one creator who has given rise to the universe, and in whose creative will it finds its unity. So, what did I put here? Unity of source and purpose, not essence. Yes. So it's not a pagan unity. In other words, you find your purpose. At the same time, the Greeks showed the Hebrews the logical implication of their monotheism. In the Hebrew idea of sole creatorship by a transcendent deity, there is the basis for the idea that the world is a real one. God has spoken it into existence as an entity separate from himself. It is not merely an emanation of the gods. In short, Greek logic helped to prove that this world is not a hologram, but a real physical existence created by a transcendent, unmoved mover. But the Greeks could show the Hebrews that in this real world, there is a linkage of cause and effect that the Hebrews tended to overlook in their emphasis on the first cause. That said, the principle of cause and effect is found in the covenant promises of Yahweh. Yahweh says, if you will, then I will. He also says, if you won't, then this is what happens. He teaches cause and effect to his people from the get-go. Now, there is a basis for the law of non-contradiction in the recognition that God is not the world and the world is not God. There was a comment here. I guess I didn't put it in there. Okay. Whoops. There is such a thing as truth, capital T, transcendent truth, because the one creator of the universe is absolutely reliable and faithful to his word. Hence, objective truth or transcendent, what I call capital T truth. The idea that the creator is primarily known in this world, and especially in relation to the unique events in human historical experience, provides this basis for the concept of historical responsibility. The modern concept of historic recording, personal responsibility, and the way in which the past drives the present, which in turn determines the future, it's all subordinate to the will of Yahweh. And the Greeks can help the Hebrew understand this. But if you're expecting the Bible to record history in the same way we do today, you have to acknowledge that the way we record history today is the end result of an evolutionary process that started with the Bible. So we should expect our recording of history to be more evolved today than it was back then. You don't say, well, that couldn't possibly be, so that's not real history. It's history in their cultural perspective, and it's probably accurately recorded, and therefore we can go test it. And notice how the scoffers and skeptics of the Bible never do that. They never test the Bible on its merits. They always confine it to an artificial argument that the Bible doesn't make. Then they go defeat. That's straw man, folks, and that's a false argument, false dichotomy. It's all sorts of fallacy. Oswald continues to be true. The full development of this combination was a long time in coming. The Platonic cast of much of the early Christian thought perhaps did more to hinder than it did to help it, because Plato was still stuck in materialism. So this rationality got in the way of the spiritual faith involved. Gnosticism in the 2nd century was a problem for Christianity. It is only with the recovery of Aristotle that resulted from the various interactions with Islam, beginning with the Crusades, that the full implications began to get worked out. This is when the Greek philosophers get, quote unquote, staved, recovery of Aristotle. Then for the first time, logic and science began to be worked out in detail. Folks, these disciplines require a mature biblical worldview before they can be systematically developed. That takes a course of time. People have to grow and mature into these ideas. Hence, the biblical play. You're in the kingdom. You're recovering the kingdom as understood at Eden. That takes time. At last, logic and science had an understanding of metaphysical reality under them that was fully consistent with them. So it's harmonized. Natural law as part of the transcendent creator's natural will. It explains Romans 1 and 2 in the way Locke sees it, and Newton and some of the other great scientists of our time, of the founding era. That's how they saw it, not like Hobbes. At the same time, the Christendom of the Dark Ages was called back from the bifurcation between heaven and earth that had sprung up from essentially a magical view of faith. That Gnosticism was taking over the church. Gnosticism, because the church has pagan. It was Catholic Church at the time. The Catholic Church was pagan. You have the Reformation, which doesn't fully remove itself from that pagan church because it still keeps Sunday. The Catholics say it still is subservient to the Catholic paganism. This is where syncretism gets into the Christianity. You get Christmas, you get Easter, you get all the Halloween, you get all these pagan things that's syncretism, folks. And what has happened is the transcendent faith of the 1st and early 2nd century over a period of time the paganism crept into it and it brought it back down to a worldly faith. It's now pagan, straight up pagan. And it's not meant, I'm not saying this necessarily as an insult. It's just, that's what the word means. You don't believe in the monotheistic God. You believe in a pagan worldview and polytheism. That's all it means. I'm using the word strictly in that sense. Let's stop right here. I know that we're going to go to a 3-minute break. Natasha, if you don't mind, we're going to do another 3-minute break for those that need to make a quick break. We'll come back and we'll finish this out for today. Find a different song and let her rip, Natasha. Mr. Holt said he was not expecting holographic theory to be mentioned in this lesson. I warned you. This book study is being used as a springboard for me to bring everything I've learned in my lifetime together into the one unified picture that I'm now seeing. We're going to go anywhere my silly little brain takes us. So Charlie did tell you, buckle up, 5-point harness. You never know where we're going to end up going with this one. All right, we only have 4 pages left, so let's get on it. The necessity of the biblical worldview. One important conclusion that must be drawn from all of this is that contrary to the 19th and 20th century delusion, science and logic are not self-evident. And technically they're not, because they're transcendent means that, let me stop right here for a minute. I want to explain the philosophical implications of transcendence. You and I are finite beings, meaning we have a beginning and an end. This universe is finite. The Bible says so. It has a beginning and an end. What we think we know about science tells us it had a beginning and an end. We may not understand all of it entirely, but it has a beginning and an end. The Greeks logically figured it had to have a beginning and an end. The fact that you are finite means that you are not going to be able to even comprehend of the infinite. You might come up with an idea of infinity, but you can't understand it. It's not possible. And most people will, Joe, I can think of infinity. No, you're thinking of the infinity sign, or you're thinking, oh, well, it's without end. You haven't truly comprehended infinity yet. And through the course of this book study, I'm going to keep explaining the concept of infinity. And I'm not telling you I understand it. I know that I don't. I cannot. So here's the principle. The finite cannot comprehend the infinite, nor can you imagine it. So to the extent that you understand infinity now, or you understand the idea of transcendence, it is a result of the biblical narrative. That's where those ideas in human mankind come from. This was one of the limitations of the Greeks. They could get to the idea of the logos, which was the natural law of the universe. They were still stuck in that the unmoved mover was the universe itself thinking. They were still stuck in the pagan paradigm. They had never truly ejected themselves from that paradigm. They couldn't. They had no conception of that. The easiest way to put this is a fish don't know it's wet. That's the fish trying to understand the concept of wet. It has no understanding of wet because that's all it knows. So I cannot stress to you how important and how paradigm shaking the notion of infinity was when the Bible, of transcendence rather, when the Bible came out. So the idea of logic in science, they're not self-evident. They cannot stand on their own, and they can't. You have to have a creator as the lawgiver. It was not until the biblical idea of a personal, transcendent, purposeful creator was allowed to undergird them that science and logic was able to fully develop and to come into their own. Without that undergirding, they fall to the ground under a barrage of contrary data, just as Euripides' pale, rationalistic men fell under the knives of the vital, earthly women. We, in the last 2 centuries, have shown the truth of this statement. We have tried to make logic and science stand on their own, and they have begun to destroy themselves. This is secular humanism, folks. It doesn't work, and it'll destroy itself because you have no authority. You're trying to base logic and reason and science in something that has no authority. You say, well, yeah, Joe, it's got its own authority. Folks, that's begging the question in circular reasoning. You're defining something with the definition. You say, well, that's what is. I can't define is with is. So you say, well, science is its own authority. It's fallacious. You can't do that. Science can only exist if there's a higher authority that provides a system of rules, logic, and things like that by which we can exercise the method of investigation. Now, a Greek could have told you that because he would have understood the logic, but he would not have fully understood the source of that authority or the source of logic itself. This is why it was important I explained to you on Tuesday. You cannot prove the existence of reason using reason because you're presupposing the existence of that which you're trying to prove exists. It's all fallacious. So the unique linkage of Greek and Israelite thought led to several characteristic features of Western civilization. And you have to remember, you grew up in this civilization, so you're a little bit of the fish trying to understand what it means to be wet. It takes some serious world traveling or philosophizing or trading to learn how to mentally kick yourself out of the Western world and say, okay, what's that mean? It takes a lot of reading or a lot of study. It takes effort to learn how to do that. Oswald said, he says, included amongst these features of the Western civilization are the validity of reason, the importance of history, the worth of the individual, and the reality of nature. Okay, this is why in the Asian cultures, the individual doesn't matter that much. They're still very much in a pagan worldview. They always have been. Christianity has still never taken over their culture. So they still have that and they don't care about human life. This is why in World War II, the Russians didn't care about human life. They just bonsai charges of their own, human wave attacks that cost millions of lives needlessly. The human life meant nothing to them because they were pagan. In their case, they were, secular humanists, but still a form of paganism. So the worth of an individual, the reality of nature. But in the revolt of the Enlightenment against what it saw as the stultifying strictures of Christian dogma, these and other results were made ultimate values. So in other words, reason is going to become our new God. What has happened? Rationality has become rationalism. Religion with man as his own God because man's reason killed God, etc., etc. We have made the human mind the measure of all things, and the result was a century in which two of the chief accomplishments were Buchenwald and Hiroshima. Rationalism has taught us that there is nothing worth thinking about. History has become historicism, in which we assert that finally we can know nothing about the past except what we make up to serve our own historical fictions. This is why we can't go back and look at what really happened to founding fathers in regards to race and race relations and slavery, the issue of slavery. History no longer matters to the people who are bringing this stuff up. Only that they have something to point to use in the here and now as a hammer to hammer you flat to get what their will. Might makes right. So the race card, that's a result of paganism, folks. Individuality has become individualism, in which we assert that the individual rights come before everything else, with the result that we are each locked in our lonely isolation. This is extreme individualism as espoused by the likes of none other than Rush Limbaugh. This is the problem we have with the libertarian movement. Our founding fathers did not believe that. Yes, they believed in the rights of the individual, but they also believed in the rights of the community, which is why they formed commonwealths. That's what Israel was. Ancient Israel was a commonwealth. You still have duties to the society in which you live, duties to your family, duties to other people above and outside of yourself, because you have a duty to the transcendent creator who made those people as well. So that's the paradigm the founding fathers lived in. And the reason that modern day conservatism cannot recapture it is because modern day conservatism is pagan. It won't. No, Joe, I'm Christian. And Christianity is pagan. It's polytheistic. No, it's not, Joe. All the saints, each one of those saints represents an ancient deity. What? Yeah, you got some studying to do there, Lucci. Yes. Like I said, I'm going to bring up a lot of things I've never mentioned to you before. If you want me to show you where to go find this, just email me. I'll show you right where to find it. I have the receipts. I'll be happy to provide them. Just ask for them. Nature has become naturalism, in which the cosmos becomes an end in itself, serving its own implicable, mindless, and deterministic ends. That's the force, folks. That's, in many ways, Western culture and civilization is playing out the Bacchia again. So when we killed Yahweh in the public square, the inevitable fallback into the material occurred. We fell from transcendence. We can no longer answer the so what questions. Reason for what? History for what? Individuality for what? Nature for what? In the absence of these answers, we fall back to the pursuit of survival, dominance, comfort, and pleasure, which is what we're seeing in the country now. How has this happened? It has happened because the leaders of the Enlightenment thought Greek logic and science could stand on their own. They thought that the biblical understanding of reality was a hindrance that must be cut away so that rationality, history, individual worth, and natural reality can stand forth in their own worth. See, had to do away with the idea of the supernatural. Well, in the case of doing away with the supernatural, which is the transcendent world, you did away with the very foundations of reason and science. Surely there was some reason for this attitude. The church of the late 18th century, whether Orthodox, Roman Catholic, or Protestant, was an intensely conservative institution intent on preserving itself and putting down all those who wish to think for themselves. That is not a biblical perspective. You're allowed to think for yourself, especially if you are focused on the Creator. You're supposed to think for yourself. That's why you were made in His image. But tragically, comment on the board here sounds like how we keep repeating history. Yes, that's why we keep repeating history, because we're pagan in our thinking. We're not thinking transcendent. If we think transcendent, the Bible tells us, remember, 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 remember. I think it's 226 times in the Bible by the NASB translation. Why are we told to remember? so that we can learn from what has happened before and not repeat it in the future. We won't do that because we keep falling back into the materialistic worldview. Oswald's going to call it the worldview of continuity or continuousness. We'll get to that. So what we have here is it was a hindrance. So by stripping it away, they left logic and science defenseless against the old gods. And hence, when the church ceased to bind those old gods by being faithful in prayer and obedience to Yahweh, those gods have returned, exactly like the Bible told us they would. And it's the exact same gods, and they're pushing the exact same agenda and with the exact same symbology, and the world doesn't see it today because we don't study history. So in his book, Return of the Gods, Jonathan Cahn details some of this. So in this book, Oswald again, in this book, I want to examine the distinctive view of reality that is first found in the Old Testament and as it presently stands, and which provides the underlying assumptions for the New Testament. I will show why current attempts to describe the Bible as one more of the world's great myths are incorrect. I will argue that in the end, there are only two worldviews, the biblical one and the other one. I will demonstrate why the Christian faith cannot be other than exclusivist. Like today, modern times, this everybody gets to heaven, they're always to heaven, all gods are one. No. We take a great offense to the idea that Jesus is the only way to heaven. Well, it must be. If the faith is transcendent, then that means that there's only one transcendent creator. There are not going to be two. Now you're into polytheism, you're back down to the pagan way of looking at things. The reason that there's only one transcendent creator, it's a logical argument that the Greeks were aware of. You don't need more than one. And this is why Yahweh says, I am that I am. I am that which must be. But he has no others. There are no other in like kind. He's alone in that sense. He created so that he can have companionship. So it says, Oswald says, I will show how current trends in the United States in particular are the logical result of the loss of biblical faith. What happens when a nation forgets God? In passing, I will ask whether any other explanation than the ones in the Bible, the ones the Bible claims, direct communication with the one God, can explain where this understanding of reality came from. In the end, I hope to have convinced younger readers, especially, of the necessity of standing absolutely firm on the biblical understanding of reality and giving no quarter to what is in the end the enemy. And that's where we are going to stop with that today. So we've gone almost 2 hours today. This is what you can expect for the rest of this book. I will interject when and where I see fit, and I will bring everything else that I have learned in my life into this lesson. I will philosophize on it. I will explain where his argument is taking me and why. I will not always be able to post all of that here on the show or in the show notes. If you want anything, email joe@theroadtoconcord.com. I will send you a link to the book, the essay, or wherever I get it from. I'm not finding this stuff in a vacuum. In some cases, what you may end up with is my own argument for where I got and how I got there. I'll give you that in return. But I am happy to give you the receipts. You have to ask for them. Otherwise, a lot of this, you're just going to have to listen to the argument and decide what it means for you, for yourself. But oh boy, I don't know how I missed this the first time I read this book. Probably because I was missing some of the pieces. Probably because I didn't have Dr. Heiser under my belt yet. I didn't have the scepter and the birthright under my belt yet. And I didn't have a few other things. Yeah, the puppies are demanding my attention. I'm sorry about that, guys. They've decided there's a terrorist in the yard somewhere. Probably the deer. For all I know, it could be a bird or a duck in the pond or a turtle got out of the fence, and who knows. But this is what we're going to be doing for the next probably 10 shows. There are 10 chapters, I believe. And I'm going to handle each one in a show, no matter how long that takes me, because I don't want to go much longer than 2.5 months with this yet. 10 chapters. Because after this, we need to get into Islam. And trust me, by that time, we will be pushing up against Ishmael in our study on Genesis and those. It's just, The timing of how this is coming together on this show is beyond my explanation, other than transcendent providence. So not only am I teaching it, we're demonstrating it in the process, live, right in front of you. And I consider that to be what the world would call supernatural. So that's just me. All right, we're going to get out of here. We love each and every one of you. Share the show if you think this will help anybody. Remember, don't miss one of these. I can't go back and recover things, go over them again. You need to keep up with this study. Probably going to be hour and a half, 2 hours each chapter, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But this one, I'm excited to teach this one. This is one of the most valuable things I've done in my mind, because this is high-level apologetics. High-level apologetics, world-class apologetics. Not me, him. I'm just explaining everything he's given me to you in the best way I know how to explain it. So we love you. We thank you for being here. I know that this one's going to push you. Stick with it. Until we see you again tomorrow, next 2 chapters of Dr. Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm. We're going to be wrapping that up next week. So until we see each other again, y'all stay safe. Take care. We love you. Bye-bye. We're out of here, Natasha.